Well, the rains may have eased over New South Wales and parts of Queensland, but it's not time to be complacent. Authorities say some rivers may not have reached their peak in the downpour and flood warnings remain in place.
While some residents are returning to inspect their damaged properties, the worst may not yet be over. Well, joining us now is Ashish Sharma, who is a Professor of Hydrology and Water Resources at the University of New South Wales. Ashish, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this morning. So we've now have the rain easing. We've got flood warnings, though, still in place in some areas. How long do you think before the water actually completely recedes?
Well, it sort of depends on the soil type, the rate at which the soil absorbs the water, and the type of sunshine we have, and the slope of the land. But typically, it'll take about, I guess, give or take 7 days is a rough estimate. We should find things to be kind of back to normal.
I've always wondered, I know what happens in coastal areas and areas around the rivers. I know the water goes back to the coast and the water goes back to the rivers, of course. But what about inland flooding? Where does the water go there?
So when you have flood events, basically this is what is the reason why you have water in rivers, even though it hasn't been raining for the last month or 2 months. What happens is water seeps into the subsurface, and once it is in the subsurface, it raises the water level, the groundwater level. And that groundwater level is what feeds the river. That is why you see water in the rivers. So basically, even if you don't have rain and you see water in the rivers, it's because of this type of recharge. Unfortunately, this year we had a paper come out earlier this year that said that the recharge in major river basins across the world, it might actually be decreasing because of increasing warmer temperatures. So even this part is impacted by climate change, as is flooding and as is drought.
Right, I see. So now, before we go on to talk a little bit more, I want to talk about the urban areas. We've seen a lot of flooding in the rural, regional areas as well, but the urban areas were also very much affected, particularly Sydney. You would think that Sydney would have good drainage. So explain to us the flooding that happened in inner city Sydney.
So most urban centers around the world are experiencing greater incidents of flooding. And one reason that causes this is that unlike rural areas, urban areas don't have a lot of soil that acts as a buffer and absorbs that water. So in urban areas, it's a bit like switching on the tap in your kitchen sink. So whatever comes into the kitchen tap into the sink, it'll just go down the drain, and that is what happens in urban areas. Plus, on top of it, temperatures are warmer, so you're having bigger rains come along, and the old stormwater infrastructure that was designed, it was designed not expecting the type of changes we have had in the last 50 to 70 years. And it's happening across the world. You see these incidents of urban flooding literally across all the major city centers in the world.
I want to stay with the topic of building and particularly residential building and development. There's a lot of talk now about whether we should be building and developing on flood-prone areas as well. You talk about climate change as well. This is, of course, something that we need to take into consideration in the future when we are developing and building residential homes as well. What can be done to help properties that are on flood-prone areas?
So this is not a new problem. We have had people living on floodplains, and we have had interventions that have been put in place by governments and councils around the world to deal with such situations. So the interventions can be pretty drastic. You have cases of Tokyo basically having an underground massive water tank that stores up extra amount of water and then pumps it out later on once the flood is receded. Or they can be a bit more subtle, like green type of interventions, including things like green pavings or green elements to the city that basically absorb more water. But it doesn't happen naturally. It has to be brought on through some type of intervention on our part. And essentially what I'm trying to say is that flooding is not a new problem, and we have some of the best expertise in water resources, in Australia as a country. I mean, there are some 10 odd universities, Australian universities, that are listed in the top 100 in the world in this particular area. And so we are basically kind of like world leaders in this space. And the point is, we just need an opportunity to be able to contribute and develop solutions, time-tested solutions. And this is a problem that can be managed. It'll be costly, but it's better to spend the money now rather than wait for bigger and bigger and bigger problems to arise later into the future.
And as you alluded to, of course, earlier, Ashish, the fact that, this has been said as it's been called a 1-in-100-year flood event, but with global warming, we are more likely to see more of these sort of events on a more frequent basis.
That is so true. That is so true. Just to give a very crude analogy, a 1-in-100-year event is something that may be occurring, say, once in 20 years. But that is not the end of the story. The 1-in-1-year event, which is responsible for filling up our dams, may be occurring once in 2 years. And so 2 years ago, Warragamba Dam had 41% water in it. Right now, it's 100%. The point is, we are being impacted on both sides of the spectrum, and both of them cause water insecurity. But it should not take a disaster for us to realize the problem that we are getting ourselves into, the vulnerability we are getting ourselves into. I mean, we have to take action. We have to do something about it before it gets too late.
Ashish, thank you very much for that warning. We appreciate you sharing your insight with us on Weekend Breakfast this morning. Ashish Sharma there, Professor of Hydrology at UNSW. Thank you.
Thank you.